The Royal Naboo N1 Starfighter is unlike other Star Wars ships. It's smooth, it's sleek, it's shiny, all of which stand out in the setting that basically invented the used future aesthetic. Doug Chang, when he designed the N1, took inspiration from boats, race cars, and in particular F1 racing boats, a thing that I didn't even know existed until I started research for this video. Now, when making my own, I knew I couldn't just build a plain old yellow and chrome N1, if you can even call yellow and chrome plain or old. But before I get started, we should do some housekeeping. What's up everyone, I'm Sublight Drive, and I haven't put out a video for like 4 or 5 months. Why is that? Well, my wife and I bought a house, which is pretty self-explanatory, but in particular it means that my workstation, which for the last 3 or 4 years has been our dining room table, had to be cleaned up and packed away. Now, the new house has a whole entire room for my new workspace, and needless to say, I was excited. But when we first moved in, it was just a slightly undersized carpeted bedroom. I had to put in some serious time and effort to make it into a proper studio. I should also say that I was able to furnish this whole space thanks to you. Everyone who's bought one of my kits or templates or just watched one of my videos has made it possible for me to move off of the kitchen table and into a real room. Huge thanks to all of you. I really do appreciate everyone who's helped me reach this point, even in the smallest of ways. I was also fortunate enough to be contacted by the folks at Hobbyzone.pl, who were kind enough to send me some of their modular organizers in exchange for showing them off in a video. It worked out well since I was reorganizing all of my stuff anyway, and I really do like the organizers, even though I was very impatient about waiting for the wood glue to dry. I may or may not keep up this same arrangement, but if I do mix it up, it'll be a piece of cake since all of the parts are magnetized. Okay, and with my space all set up and ready to go, let's get to building. I actually bought this kit while I was watching the Mandalorian episodes of Book of Boba Fett. And, I mean, literally while I was watching it. I opened up eBay and bought this kit before the episode was even over, and at the time, I had fully intended to do it up as Din Djarin's Naboo Starfighter. I never got around to it, and the kit just kind of sat around collecting dust, but I figured it would be perfect for a slightly smaller project while I figured out my new workroom. I went back and forth a bit on what to do with this particular kit, but eventually I decided I'd be inspired by the inspiration, and painting it to look like an F1 race car. Now, this is hardly original. I was particularly influenced by Boonta Modeling, who has given a similar treatment to a few different Star Wars vehicles, including his own Naboo Starfighters. He does great work, and if you don't already follow him, you should. This kit is, well, there's only like 15 individual pieces, and when dry fitting the parts, they only mostly fit together. So I was pretty quickly realizing that it was going to be a bit more work than I planned on, but there's nothing wrong with that. To start, I droppered out a bit of Weld on 3 and glued together a couple of parts I knew I wanted to be in place before I started making modifications. I admit that while I was pretty enamored by how shiny and reflective the silvered parts of the kit were, I really should have just stripped it all off before starting. Whatever it's made of, it just slightly resisted the weld on, enough to cause me some problems later. For now though, it's holding things just fine. Once the front was semi-held together, I got to cutting out some holes. My thinking here was that I could gesture towards the suspension on an F1 car and fill the space here with some spars or axles. Some tape kept the initial cut straight, but in the end I just kind of ripped at it until I had a hole and then filed it clean. To give myself some space for greebling later, I opened up some similar holes in the sides of the fuselage. The tape was a lot more useful here since it kept my cuts symmetrical across the two sides. Now, I knew I wanted to have some exposed engine parts instead of the completely smooth nacelles. So I held everything together with some masking tape and then sawed right through a half-inch section of each side. I wanted to keep the pointed tips, so I made sure to sand them clean once they came off. From here, it was time to start kitbashing. I found this was kind of an odd little challenge, since I knew I wanted a roughly radially symmetric engine, but if I just stacked up a bunch of wheels and hubcaps and stuff, I'd get something complicated but lacking a lot of detail. I lucked out and found these two identical cannon barrels from a tank kit that I have of some kind. With these, I could build up from a smaller base that still had some stuff going on underneath. The rest of these circular parts are mostly tank and airplane wheels, with a styrene rod down the middle to center everything. Wires and tubes were definitely a requirement here, since if there's anything I've learned looking at jet engines, is that they are absolutely riddled with crazy complex tubes and wires and whatever. Which obviously means that spaceship engines are as well. I've got a bunch of different kinds of wire, and don't ask me what they are, because I really don't know. Being perfectly honest, I'm not even really sure where a lot of these came from. I like this little bitty wire because all I need to do is just glue one end in place, and then I just sort of strunkle it up into whatever arrangement makes it fit. As long as I don't mess them up too much, it adds a lot of really tiny, dense detail. Last, I'm going to put in those suspension rods I talked about right when I started cutting. This is just some pieces of sprue and styrene rod, nothing fancy. I'm not 100% convinced it's the look I want, but no going back now. Next, I need to fill in these holes I made in the fuselage. For a backing, I cut out a few pieces of sheet styrene that was fit to the same size as the hole. Now, before I put the backing in place, I had a slightly larger greebly that happened to fit perfectly in each side, and then I found some smaller pieces that I liked the look of. To hide the gaps between the fuselage and the backing, I used this styrene half rod, which lays flat, so it fits a bit nicer. Once all the plastic pieces were in place, I put in a bit of guitar string, which has a bit more texture to it than just a plain old wire. Next, I want the tail to have a bit more going on with it, so I'm going to cut out a section to replace with some exposed ends. I made sure to keep the cutout section to use as a size reference because I want to have a few small pieces of styrene to be like little baffles or supports. I probably overthought this and used a few pieces of wire to make a bunch of differently sized cross sections to cut out. Once I popped them all out, I could take a piece of styrene rod, the same length as the tail section I removed, and drill a hole down the center of each of the baffles. Then I could slip them onto the rod one at a time to form the skeleton for building up more detail. Now, the tip of the tail was, well, kind of crappy. It's blunt, kind of bent, and just didn't really look to scale. So to fix that up, I'm using a trick I learned from the Gundam people to make it a little bit sharper and pointier. Once the tail was done, I could stick everything together. Now, this model needs a good amount of gap filling to make it presentable. In the past, I've used plain old superglue as a gap filler, which works, but I've had a few people suggest melting down some sprue in plastic cement, or in my case, weld-on, to use instead, so I'm going to give it a try for this project. I found the most annoying part of this was keeping the fluidity consistent. As I worked, I could literally see the goop evaporating and getting thicker, which meant that I had to work fast and occasionally top it back up with a weld-on. The goopiness also allowed some air bubbles to creep in, but you can't really see it at this stage. Overall, it was a pain in the butt, but then gap filling and sanding kinda always is. Using melted styrene has certainly found a place in my arsenal, but I think I'm going to stick to using superglue for the time being, at least for most situations. Once things were smoothed out, it was time to add a few final details. I have a couple aerodynamically shaped parts that I really don't get many opportunities to use. These missile attachment points from a model jet, and the wings off of this tiny airplane that came with an aircraft carrier kit, for example. And finally, the R2 unit needs to be put in place. I thought briefly about putting something else in this spot, but how can I say no to that face? And with that, construction was finished. But I'm not quite done yet. The kit came with a stand, but I figured if I'm going to use it, I may as well customize the label. The original text had to come off, which was kind of a pain, but ultimately not too hard. Now, I had a great idea of cutting out some styrene text on my Cameo cutting machine, but even at all the highest settings, it's not going to cut all the way through the plastic. This is fine for long, straight cuts that I can snap clean, but of course, text doesn't have a lot of long, straight cuts. So I ended up needing to cut out all of the letters by hand. The scores made by the machine definitely made this easier, but it was still kind of a pain in the butt. I'll have to experiment some more to figure out if there's a better way to do this, because I suspect that there is. Once all the letters were out, though, it was easy enough to cement them into place on the stand. Now, color-wise, I was not about to pull any punches here. So many of the models that I make are some variation on dirty gray, so I wanted to go out of my comfort zone here and paint this in pink and black. That means that once the primer is on, put down a base coat of pink, and then masked things off and did a layer of black. Unmasking was very scary here, because I really had no idea if the pattern I had put down would look good or not. But with all the tape off, I think I'm pretty happy with this. If nothing else, it's definitely going to stand out in my display case. Of course, I had to give the pilot a matching paint job in pink and black, and once he was done up, he of course had to get some brand sponsorships. Speaking of sponsorships, I said I wanted an F1 inspired paint scheme, and that means brands and logos. I started with some racing numbers on the nose here, but after that, it was space capitalism all the way down. These are, of course, the same little logos that I designed for a project a few years back, which I had custom printed. Once they were all in place, a gloss clear coat sealed them all up nice and good. Next, the exposed mechanical bits are a bit bland right now, so I'm going to juice them up with some metallic alcohol pens. I have a bunch of metallic paints and stuff, but honestly I like the pens best for this kind of thing. They're just convenient, and the results look just as good or even better in some cases, in my opinion. Now for weathering. For reference here, I did look at a few pictures of the kind of damage that F1 cars accumulate during a race, but it turns out that F1 cars just sort of instantly disintegrate when they're hit by anything, rather than accumulating damage over time. Which, in retrospect, is kind of obvious since they're mostly made of carbon fiber wrapped around a roll cage in an engine. So, in other words, I'm just kind of winging it here. Just a few paint scratches in the front feels the way to go here, so that's what I'm doing first. This is a racing craft after all, not a combat fighter. For a final touch to the weathering, I'm going to add some scorch marks around the engines. Since I painted these in black, I'm using a white oil paint for the damage. It was around now that I started to regret going for such a dark black as my surface here, but we'll just call that a lesson for next time. Finally, the canopy. I put a layer of black paint on the bottom edge to help it blend with the surface a bit more, and then a bit of white glue to hold it all in place. Last, once I primed the stand in black, I used a silver alcohol pen to highlight the text and called it a wrap. And here we are at the end. If you've made it all the way through, of course, thank you for watching. I think that this was a perfect project to kick off my new workspace, and I can't wait to show off all of the stuff I've been thinking about and planning in the meanwhile. If you'd like to support the channel, or if you want to try making something yourself, I sell templates and kits on my Etsy shop, which I'll have linked below. Buying them is easily the best way to support my work, and I always love getting to see all of your guys' modifications and additions to my designs. Once again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.